Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world. And I want to send each and every one of you loads and loads of love. And I truly hope that you are doing amazingly well. And we've got a very, very interesting story tonight that is really going to pull at the heartstrings, I think. And you're really going to enjoy it. But I just want to send everybody lots of love. And don't forget to get that lovely hot cup of cocoa or tea, because I've got a fabulous story for you. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do so. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Annabella, and I'm originally from Santa Monica in California, where I was raised by a single mother in a very mediocre, rather shabby apartment block, where my mother fought tooth and nail to keep a roof over our heads. Life was exceedingly tough, and my mother worked as a waitress at a local restaurant in the evenings in order to raise enough money to provide for our every need. Growing up, my mother had a very tumultuous, turbulent childhood herself, as both her parents were alcoholics, who literally decided to hand her over to social services for adoption when she was about only 8 years old. Her parents soon realised that their daughter would have a better life if she was raised by two parents who could give her the lifestyle and attention that they believed she deserved. My mother remembers drifting from one foster home to another and being exposed to a series of so much abuse, many of it sexual by nature. It would seem that the very people entrusted to be the guardians of her care had all but taken advantage of her vulnerability and youthful naivety and exploited it with their insidious evil agendas. There were times when my mother was placed in the care of more congenial people, but sometimes the discrimination and favouritism between her and the original siblings was so blatantly obvious that she began to feel like she never ever belonged and was uncherished in every way. She was often aware that the only reason that she was being taken care of was more for monetary gain rather than for care or love. One day I remember my mother telling me that if anything was to ever happen to her, that I must promise her that under no circumstances should the authorities ever find me. I don't want you to end up in the claws of the ineffectual foster system, she would tell me. Although there are good people out there, sadly the system doesn't shelter, fortify or protect you from the very individuals that may foster you for more nefarious, iniquitous motives. I don't want you to end up emotionally damaged or traumatized, my mother would say. So if something happens to me, I want you to look for a lady called Rosa Wintergreen, who was a girl I was fostered with many long years ago. Growing up as kids, we swore we would be there for each other, through thick and thin and through hell and high water. I do not know where she is, but I know she went to live in Kentucky and is happily married now. But I lost touch with her and have no idea what her married name actually is. But if something happens to me, I want you to find her, because she will definitely take care of you, and that's a promise. I remember looking at my mother and reassuring her that nothing was ever going to happen to her, and not to worry, but my mother laughed and took me into her arms and said, "I love you more than anything in the world. That's why I want to protect you from the villainous predators out there, because believe me, they're depraved, odious sharks among the dolphins. And some of those sharks are disguised as dolphins, as a cunning, deceptive tactic to lure you into their trap. And I want to protect you from that." One day my mother came down with a very bad bout of flu, and she was unable to work for a week or so. And so I was nursing her better with chicken broth and all kinds of cough medicines. My mother told me that she was actually getting better, but the next day when I came into her bedroom with a glass of orange juice and some sliced buttered toast, I immediately sensed something was very wrong. My mother was lying back on her bed, looking like a white pasty mannequin, only her mouth was wide open, and her eyes looked like they were vacant and empty, lifeless like glass marbles. "Mum," I said, tapping her on the shoulders, but she didn't respond to my touch. I started to shake my mother violently as hard as I could, but she lay limp and lifeless in my arms, and was as cold as ice to the touch. "Mum," I said, shaking her again, only to get the same reaction. Suddenly the grim revelation that my mother was dead hit me like a ton of bricks. I felt as if all the blood had been drained from my body, and I remember I felt completely empty and devoid of any emotion. It was like a sense of hopeless despair engulfed my entire being like a ravaging disease, robbing me of the ability to feel anything at all. It was just too terrible for words. For a moment I stood there like a frozen statue, staring at my mother's corpse in total and utter disbelief. I felt certain that I was engaged in a terrifying nightmare from which I would ultimately wake up. I do remember rubbing my eyes incredibly hard just to make sure that I wasn't dreaming, but the reality became blindingly clear, like a spotlight being thrust into your face. My mother was indeed dead, and I started to shake and convulse like someone having a seizure. I remember it was like the floodgates opened and the rain pelted down my face in heavy, thunderous showers. I began to sob and sob and sob until I could literally cry no more because I was like a dry vessel. I held my mother's corpse in my arms for many long hours, telling her how much I loved her and what she meant to me. And then I surrendered to the excruciating emotional exhaustion of this horrifying event and fell into a deep sleep, clutching her dead body very tightly. I remember waking up 24 hours later with the sun streaming through the room and a warm, cheerful radiance lit up the whole area. It looked like a blissfully beautiful day, but it was anything but. I was amazed to see that there were blowflies buzzing around my mother's body and already feasting on her eyes. It was so awful to see her like this, and I knew her body was decomposing very quickly. I stayed in the apartment for a couple of days until I could bear it no longer, as my mother's body began to bloat and take on a sweet, sickly odour, and was pungent and vile in its smell that made me feel so hideously sick. Let's just say when you have smelt a dead body, you never ever forget that smell. It stays with you like a recorded memory that you can just never shift. I knew I needed to get out of the apartment because there was no money to pay for the rent, and my mother's body needed to be moved before the apartment block stunk to high heaven. I said my final goodbyes to my mother. I knew that I would have to call the authorities later, but not while I was in the apartment, because I would be immediately whisked into foster care, and that could never happen. I had one mission now, and that was to find Rosa Wintergreen in Kentucky. I gathered a few belongings together in a backpack, which included a flashlight, some clothes, and a sleeping bag, along with about $20, and that was all that I had in the world. I was well and truly homeless, and because I was so emotionally distraught, I didn't really care about anything anymore, which I believed helped me to cope and subsequently adapt to the shock of ultimately being homeless. Many people have asked me since the ordeal, what was the first day being homeless like? I have one answer alone, and that was that I was emotionally too numb to even remember. Once I'd left my home, I informed the authorities anonymously about my mother's deceased body and left them to deal with her remains. I knew that I would never be able to attend her burial because that would expose me to social services, and that just couldn't happen. Fast forward several days, and I'd literally been sleeping rough on Venice Beach. I was amazed to discover how many perfectly decent human beings like myself were so down on their luck and had subsequently been made homeless. It seemed so dreadfully unfair. One man had once been a millionaire, and through a series of fortuitous random events that he could never have predicted, had subsequently ended up losing absolutely everything. At one time he had owned 2 homes and a boat, and literally lost it all. So it can happen to pretty much anyone. At only 14 years of age, some of the older homeless people kept a close watch over me, and I was warned to sleep over my shoes because they would be stolen from me when I slept. How crazy is that? Some of the homeless people had been in and out of shelters and low-income housing for years on end, invariably always ended up back on the streets. And there were those that were literally homeless because they wanted to spend every last penny on drugs, such as meth and heroin, without forking out any rent, while others chose to indulge in drugs to help them overcome the stress of actually being homeless. Their attitude was if they were down on their luck anyway, they might as well be as high as a kite. Some believed the meth helped them to keep awake at night so that they could guard all their stuff from potential thieves who might steal things while they were fast asleep. Then there were people that were clearly mentally disturbed, suffering from mental disorders, and they were the scariest people of all because they could be sweet one moment and volatile, aggressive and explosive the next, and sometimes even dangerous. I also met youngsters like myself who'd run away from foster homes with stories that sounded remarkably like my mother's harrowing account. I knew then that I would rather be homeless than exposed to the potential abuse of a foster home. Not that all foster homes are like that, of course. I was warned by a very kindly man to sleep at close proximity to him during the night so he could keep an eye on me, because women had been exposed to very serious dangers sleeping homeless, from being beaten up and sexually assaulted. I began to realise how hugely challenging it was to be homeless and how vulnerable I actually was. During the day I developed a fabulous technique in hiding all my belongings away, as I didn't want to carry out anything around with me during the day, like those homeless people do with their shopping trolleys. Those ones are very sad indeed. I was to discover a dark blanket in a dumpster dive with some of the homeless people, and believe me, dumpster diving is the most disgusting, revolting thing to have to do. But believe me, people do throw out some really good stuff, even new things, which is incredible, but you usually find that at the bottom of the dumpster, and all the horrible stuff you have to get through first before you finally get to the good things. It's always the way. Isn't that uncanny? I would cover up my worldly possessions with this brown blanket and leave them up in the branches of a tree, and it was almost impossible to see that it was even there, because the brown of the blanket perfectly camouflaged all my possessions, which meant I was free to do as I pleased without being lumbered with my stuff during the day. There were homeless people that did have full-time jobs, but they still could not afford a roof over their heads, which for me was insane to see. How crazy is that? I could not bear the idea of begging, because that is the most degrading thing to do. And so I took the initiative of walking around residential areas, knocking on doors, asking people if they needed a dog walker or someone to wash their cars. And the people did not realise I was homeless, so many agreed to give me a few odd jobs, which I was very grateful for. I'm afraid that people do often look on the homeless like a lower form of pond life that you want to avoid at all costs, because you just might catch the debilitating disease from them. I think they thought I was a 14-year-old kid looking to make some extra pocket money, but I never ever gave them the impression of being homeless, which you definitely don't want to do. I began to raise enough money to pay for a trip to Kentucky, because my hope lay in ultimately finding Rosa Wintergreen. Many of my homeless friends warned me not to get my hopes up at all, because they felt that it would end up all blowing in my face. The one thing I noticed about my homeless friends is that they were so intent on just surviving one day to the next that many of them had no focus whatsoever on the future, and that horrified me. You could ask them about their long-term intentions, and they really did not know. They seemed so reluctant to visualise a brighter future for themselves, which was awfully sad. One girl told me that she would never ever dare to look in the windows at Bloomingdale's because she knew she would never be able to afford to buy any of those nice things, which would cause her to feel very depressed and downcast. I remember thinking that her gloomy outlook on life was ultimately sealing her fate, because she refused to entertain any possible hope that tomorrow might possibly be a brighter day. It was so ingrained in her psyche that things would never ever change for her, and invariably they didn't. I, on the other hand, would go to Bloomingdale's and decide exactly what accessories I would have in my bedroom when I finally had that home of my own. I visualised it so intently in my head and could see myself moving in with Rosa and her family, and I knew it would happen because I could see it so clearly that it was that tangible and that real for me. The only problem is that it had not manifested yet in my reality, but I knew that I would be soon grabbing it with both of my hands. My homeless friends just could not understand why I was so positive and upbeat about what they considered was a very bleak future for me. I would be told things like, "Don't get your hopes up. You're going to be so disappointed. It's never going to work out for you. You're never going to make any money." And I was ambushed and assaulted with all these negative words and thoughts, but I refused to believe and engage in any of them, because life without hope is a life that is defeated. Fast forward a month or so, and I had left Venice Beach, and I was now in Kentucky. I was making tracks to an abandoned home that I'd heard about surreptitiously on a bus ride, and it seemed like the perfect spot for me to make a temporary base, while I conducted my search for Rosa Greenwood that I was beginning to realise was looking like a needle in a haystack. When I did find the location of this abandoned home, I was almost reluctant to enter the area, as the derelict white house that was built on an elevated wooded clearing was so overgrown with long, vigorous seeded grass that was thick and dense. Everything was so jungly, and there were creepers climbing all over the house very untidily. My first impression of this ramshackled place was it really had a sinister ambience, almost like the run-down abode was literally staring at you with hauntingly sinister eyes. There is something about a large, dilapidated, empty home that leaves you feeling that something is distinctly off. I do remember thinking that the house had been a quality building at some stage, that had been built with bricks and mortar and very solid foundations, and in its time it was an imposing, respectable building, but certainly not any more. I was reluctant to enter the building that was so dark and sinister even during the day, but you know what, I just didn't care, because I needed a firm base for myself, and although the house that was less than agreeable, it would just have to do. I entered the house, and as I went through the passageway into the kitchen living area, it was so much lighter, and I noticed the floors were covered in candle wax, matches and drug paraphernalia, so clearly some homeless people had been using this place as a base at some time. But they clearly had moved on and not laid down any permanent roots. I did my best to clean up the mess, but removing candle wax is not an easy job, especially off carpets, by any manner of means. This house was scantily furnished, with a large chair here and there, but it looked like someone had ransacked the whole place and all the furnishings had been removed. I spent the next few days going to supermarkets all over Kentucky and asking people if they knew any Rosas in the area, or someone with the name Rosa Wintergreen, but no one had ever heard of her, and all the Rosas they knew about had never been to foster homes before. I was beginning to feel exhausted from my search. Naturally, I had tried to access records in the area, but once again there was no one called Rosa Wintergreen that seemed to be living in Kentucky. I knew she was obviously using her married name, but I was running out of money now, and so once again I resorted to finding odd jobs to do around the area, and believe it or not, it wasn't easy. I did manage to find a job handing out flyers, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to ask people in the area if they knew of Rosa Wintergreen, but once again I drew the short straw. No one had ever heard of her. One night when I was retiring into my sleeping bag on the floor in the living area of the abandoned house, I heard the sound of someone moving around the premises, which really scared me half to death, because I realised suddenly that I was definitely not alone. All kinds of alarming thoughts entered my head. Had someone discovered that I was squatting out here on the premises? I had made my presence very discreet and covered my tracks very well, I thought. I'd be surprised if anyone had observed or seen me, but maybe I was wrong. Armed with my flashlight that I always kept very well supplied with batteries, I crept out of the house and crawled behind a tree that was surrounded by a dense thicket, so hiding for me was very easy. I did feel a lot safer outside than in that dark, sinister house. I switched my light off because it was a bright night, and the white light of the full moon illuminated the whole area. It was amazing how terribly menacing, foreboding and sinister this dingy house looked in the darkness of this night. It really looked like the film set for America's Most Haunted Buildings, or for the screening of some ghastly horror where the teenagers run for their lives from a demented, deranged killer carrying a machete in his hands. It had that kind of creepy ambience about it, if you know what I mean. I suddenly held my breath for a long moment, because I heard it again. Footsteps were walking past me, but these feet, although clearly bipedal, were very thunderous in their sound, much like the feeling of a very weighty animal walking past you, like an elephant trapeding around in the brush. I peered wearily through the undergrowth to see this enormous creature standing yards away from me. And when I say yards, I mean yards. I could almost have reached out to touch him, because that is how close he was to me. The only way I can describe him to you is he looked like a human blown up to a 10-foot-tall, 1,000-pound giant, with very obvious ape-like influences. This critter was covered in loose, shaggy, matted hair that smelt really yucky. The only way that I can describe that smell to you is it smelt like rotting garbage and meat that's on the turn. Even though it was light, I only rarely got to see how colossal and monstrously big this hairy creature was, but I also could see the conical head, the massive shoulders, and the overlong arms and human-like hands and feet. Those were very clear. I also could detect its red eyeshine. I've never been so terrified in all my life. It was the scariest moment that I've ever endured, because I could sense I was in very serious mortal danger, and I was close to staring death in the face. I was so sure the creature could hear me. Why was he standing so close to me? Did he know where I was hiding? Would he suddenly pounce on me? I tried not to make any sound, and the tension in my body was so tight that I could literally feel my whole body cramping up. But I knew I could not move a muscle, and it was killing me. I had to keep very quiet and stay very, very still. The creature appeared to be examining something very intently in his very thick fingers and rolling it around curiously in his hands. I realised with utter horror that it was my makeup mirror that had slipped out of my bag earlier in the day and dropped somewhere in the undergrowth, while this creature had somehow recovered it. The critter appeared to be examining it extremely closely, as if he was trying to figure out what on earth it actually was. He was wearing a very muddled, confused expression on his face that I could detect even in the night. Suddenly he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the mirror and was so shocked he almost dropped the mirror because he got such a fright, because he could see his face reflected back at him, but I don't think he realised it actually was him. For a moment he looked around him as if he was half expecting to see the creature that he had detected in the mirror standing near him. Once again he looked in the mirror and suddenly realised he was looking at himself, and clearly he didn't like what he was seeing, because he threw the mirror across the grass and let out a very irritated grunt, as if to say, "Well, that was a waste of time, and what a useless object that is." I can say for sure that vanity was not one of his strong points. Suddenly I could see 2 pairs of red eyeshine at about 8 feet off the ground, looking towards the giant creature, and I realised with horror that there must be others just like him around. This revelation caused me to virtually freak, but I tried to compose myself because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. But I want to tell you this, I was living on borrowed time, I felt sure of that. However, to my relief, they appeared to be chattering to him in a strange monkey language, and then I saw him walking towards the other critters, and then they suddenly bolted off into the dark night, sounding like a herd of elephants, as they thundered away. I can honestly say to you that I was overwhelmed with huge relief. As I got up, I staggered to my feet, and my body was so cramped over that it took a while to get my circulation back. I remember wondering if this creature could be the reason that the previous squatters and even owner vacated the property. I could never be sure, but one thing I was certain of was that I was never going to stay here, not for a single other night, because this creature terrified the living daylights out of me. For a long time I would wonder what the heck I saw that night. The very next day I was walking past an enchanting-looking farmhouse in the area, going to the bus stop with my backpack on my back, when I found myself talking to a kindly woman who was feeding her chickens in the backyard. She ran over to where I was and inquired after me. She was very friendly and looked at my backpack curiously. "Where are you going?" she asked me. "Oh, to the bus stop," I said. "Do you mind me asking why a young girl like you is out here on her own? Are you running away from home?" she inquired. "I don't have a home," I said, tears welling up in my eyes, and I wiped them away quickly, desperately trying to conceal them from her, but she had seen them. The woman looked at me very sympathetically. "I ran away from home once when I was a little girl, and my dad was beating up my mother at the time. I do understand, you know. I've been there myself, and it's not a pretty place to be." "You're not going to tell the authorities on me, are you?" I asked, looking at her in absolute horror. "Now, why would I do a thing like that?" she asked me. Before I knew it, I was telling this delightful woman all about my life and how I was looking for Rosa Wintergreen and had had absolutely no luck in tracing her. Fast forward a few days, and I couldn't believe it. I was actually staying with this lovely, beautiful lady called Lisa, who was trying her level best to help me locate Rosa Wintergreen, but no one had ever heard of her. It was almost as if she had never actually existed. It really was a rather extraordinary mystery. Could my mother have got the name wrong? Well, it was likely, I thought. One day Lisa hit me with the most wonderful bombshell, if you can call it that. She asked me if I would consider staying with her indefinitely, and I was utterly thrilled to pieces, because I had warmed to Lisa so much, and I could envisage a life with her. So I immediately said yes. After that, I never ever looked back, because she became the most extraordinary, loving and amazing mother to me. She would describe me as the stray cat that landed on her doorstep looking for a loving home. She would say that the thing about stray cats is that they have an incredible way of getting under your skin, and sooner or later you cannot even imagine or envisage your life without them, because you love them so very much. Lisa had 2 adult sons who had subsequently left home, so she lived on her pig farm with her husband Huck, and they ended up taking care of me and adopting me as their own daughter. Lisa once told me that she'd actually prayed to God for a daughter, and so when it never transpired, she was bitterly disappointed and aggrieved. But then it seemed that God had other ideas and had answered her prayer later on in her life, which really delighted Lisa. It was not long that I was in Bloomingdale's buying all the things that I'd visualised for my bedroom with Lisa, and we ended up living a very happy idyllic life in the countryside, where I only spent 4 months of that life homeless. I was able to discover that there was actually a woman called Rosa Greenwin, not Wintergreen, and when I met her, I realised she was indeed my mother's long-lost friend, and it was emotional to meet her and share in all the memories that she had of my mother. By this time I was so happy living with Lisa and Huck, I literally could not conceive of leaving her, because we were now family. So life really does have a funny way of actually working out. It was only in later years that I discovered that the mystical creature I had encountered that night was in fact a Bigfoot. But it is a strange way that the serendipitous events that followed led me to actually meet Lisa, so perhaps the Bigfoot played a part in that. One thing I'd like to say to all your listeners is to never ever give up. Always believe and visualize what you want your future to be, because believe me, the universe, or God if you like, will bring you that outcome, but you have to believe it first. I want to say that even when the worst comes to the worst, and supposing you were to find yourself homeless, because it does happen to some people, I want to say that the human spirit is literally built to survive, and we're all incredible fighters, with more inner strength than we give ourselves credit for. On the streets it was not as horrendous as one might imagine. It's not pleasant by any strength of the imagination, but it did make me realise that even if you were to hit rock bottom, that is not the most terrible place to be. And when you're at the bottom, the only way is actually up. So always think big for your life, be positive, and there are no limitations for your future or your dreams. I'm living proof that you can ultimately get what you believe, not what you deserve. So believe in your future, and you can reach for the stars. So there you are. That's my story. I just want to thank you for that incredible story. What an incredible experience that you went through, losing your mother like that, being homeless, out on the streets, in a very vulnerable situation, and yet having such a positive outlook towards life and envisaging a different future for yourself. And although you didn't end up with Rosa Wintergreen, or, you ended up with the most incredible mother, and you got what you hoped for because you believed in it. And I think perhaps that's a very good message to all of us, that we should never ever doubt that things can turn out for the good. Until next time, goodbye and good night.